I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Okay, I'm back for another episode of Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics, especially emphasizing friendship. Before I start, I just want to remind you that the Morin Academy has a class coming up on Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture. It's going to be taught by Spencer and myself, and it will start on October 19th. So I'll put information about that below so you can sign up. You can do it two ways, either become a patron of the Morin Academy on Patreon, or you can use Eventbrite. So let's get back into Aristotle on friendship. And just a reminder of why this is so important for our times, really, in my view, is that we suffer from a real lack of friendship in modern society. I think a lot of people don't know what it is. I don't think a lot of people know how to obtain it, how to make it happen. And in the Nichomachean Ethics, Aristotle spends a good deal of time on those questions. What is it and how to make it happen? And I've already covered now Aristotle's basic teaching on virtue, the mean between two extremes. We've talked about what it means to be a virtuous person and the reason why. And the best types of friendships evolve from equally virtuous people. Okay, so virtue begets friendship. So today, I think we've waited long enough. I want to skip to the part, I may go back and fill in a bit later, but for the next few episodes, I'd like to zero in on what Aristotle actually says about friendship, because I think that's what people have been waiting for. So here we see a picture of a guy with his dog on a dock, staring peacefully or maybe a little mopily into the lake water. Well, a lot of times we hear, that canines are the best friend, like the dog is man's best friend, right? Because the dog will always be there with you. They're always loyal, However, this is not the ideal friendship, because this is a relationship between a human being and a fairly unconscious creature who cannot share in the virtues and ways of life of his human companion. Okay. So, pets are nice to have, but pets are no substitute. They don't really give us actual friendship. At least Aristotle would say so. I know a lot of dog owners would disagree. But maybe we can kind of keep the dog in the back of our minds as we think about Aristotle's views on friendship and how well would the dog really measure up, even if it was the best dog in the world. Okay. So he says, first off, that friendship, it is a virtue, okay, or it involves virtue. And really, it's both. I mean, as you read on, you realize Aristotle considers it a virtue, and it's one that can either be practiced poorly or it can be practiced well, and that the person who is virtuous, it involves virtue, because the person who is virtuous, who is better at exhibiting the virtues that he's discussed previously, is most likely to have good friendships. So it is both a virtue and it involves virtue, And he says, besides, it is most necessary for life. And he says that because Aristotle deeply thinks that we are social creatures by nature. So socializing is not a choice, or rather, having social feelings is not a choice, right? That human beings gravitate towards each other, and that life does not seem very interesting or even worth living without human relationships. He says, for instance, no one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other goods, even if he had all the goods of virtue and the worldly goods that he says enhance happiness, such as having enough wealth, enough physical health, and so on. He says, for in fact, rich people and holders of powerful positions, even more than other people, seem to need friends. And by the way, these are usually the people who struggle the hardest to have them, because they're in a position that makes it hard to distinguish whether people are being friends with you for your sake, or because of your position. He says, for how would one benefit from such prosperity if one had no opportunity for beneficence, which is most often displayed and most highly praised in relation to friends? Meaning, what good is any amount of money or power if you can't use it to benefit your friends? Interesting thought, right? Like in the modern, like I'm in the United States, in the modern American context, I think sometimes, maybe often, wealth is seen as a vehicle for separating yourself from the need for human relationships, right? To be able to buffer yourself from dealing with too much or anything that you don't want to, right? Whereas Aristotle is saying, what's the good in wealth if you're not able to use it and think about it as a benefit to your friends? If it's not enhancing your social life, and not by buying friends, obviously, but by sharing, okay, and by enjoying the good things that you have with the people that you love, well, then why have it, right? That's how strongly he feels that we are social by nature, and we can't do without that. And then there's an indication here early on in this discussion of Aristotle's view that citizenship is a type of friendship. We're going to talk more about that later, but I'll just include this quote to give you an idea of what he's talking about. He says, friendship would seem to hold cities together, and legislators would seem to be more concerned about friendship, than about justice. For concord, or peace, would seem to be similar to friendship, and they aim at concord, or agreement, peace coming through agreement, above all, while they try above all to expel civil conflict, which is enmity. Well, there's a very different view of politics and legislation than we currently do not enjoy, right? Like, we wouldn't say that our legislators aim at friendship or concord, or to expel civil conflict or animosity. At this point, I think it would be safe to say, and maybe always, probably always actually, our political system, our representative political system, has aimed at conflict, or let's say it's thrived on it. It kind of expects it. The Madisonian vision of U.S. government actually counted on it to stop any particular faction from getting too powerful. So whatever he's talking about here is a very different view of politics and legislation than the liberal view, right? And it has to do with people who are not so much thriving on argument as arguing for the sake of agreement. In this picture here, which I don't even think is like remotely historically accurate, but I picked it because these guys they look like they're arguing, and indeed they are. And there was a lot of arguing that went on in the ancient Athenian system when it was democratic. And yet the ideal, not the reality lots of times, I'm sure, but the ideal was unity, and agreement. And the arguments, from at least from this philosophic perspective, would their aim would be concord, agreement about values, or what we would call values, about justice, and the good. All right. So I think that his notion of friendship or citizenship as a type of friendship is very challenging to the modern liberal view of what a citizen is. But we can talk more about that some other time. Okay, so what constitutes friendship? He says, does friendship arise from all sorts of people, or can people not be friends if they are vicious? I'm going to just cut to the chase and say that Aristotle doesn't think that people can be genuine friends in the real sense of the word if they are vicious, meaning if they have vice, if they are too low in their their sense of right and wrong, if they have too little self-control, if they're users, etc., then that's vicious. And real friendship can't arise from that. So we'll kind of see why as time goes by here. So Aristotle's going to talk about love for inanimate creatures. And of course, my cat is not inanimate, but not exactly friendship material in Aristotle's classic sense of the word, but not exactly a glass of wine either, right, Darnie? Yeah. Okay. So he says, love for a soulless thing, a thing without a soul, is not friendship because it is not mutual. And he literally references a glass of wine. People say they love wine. Some people are wine lovers, right? And they're connoisseurs. But the wine isn't loving you back. Although it may feel like it in the moment, in reality, it's not. And so, he goes on to say that friendship must be conscious on both ends, intentional, aware, and it must be reciprocated. Conscious, reciprocated goodwill. That's what constitutes, that's how friendship is defined, okay? It's conscious, reciprocated goodwill. So you loving your dog or your cat may be a little bit borderline, different from loving your glass of wine, but not different enough, okay? Because the cat, the dog, cannot be fully conscious of what's happening, at least as far as we know, and cannot reciprocate fully, right? Now, people can disagree about that. Fine, disagree about it. But Aristotle's aiming at a much more complex relationship, okay? It is not a friendship if one loves for utility, okay, and not for who the person is. So if you, quote, love somebody because of the position they're in, which can benefit you, or you love them because they have a car, which they let you borrow, or you love them because they allow you to have a job that you would otherwise not have. These are good things for you, but they are matters of utility. They're things that you take away. You are not loving the other person for their own sake, right? And I might say, just stop and just note, I'm using the term love because he does. Friendship is a type of love, okay? So that's why he uses the term here. Also, he says, it is not simply sharing a love for pleasure, because again, if you find the friend pleasurable in some way, right? Like you have fun with them, or they're attractive, or they play a sport well that you also enjoy, or any number of things like that. Maybe they're your drinking buddy and you like to go out and party. It's a kind of weak form of friendship. He's not saying there's no friendship at all there. But again, You are loving the person for the fun that you have with them and not for their own sake. Again, he keeps saying they are not loved for who they are, okay? So he says that these types of friendships for an inanimate object, and I guess I would include an animal in this, but, animate and souled probably, but still not a human. So love for a soulless thing, love for utility, or love for pleasure. He says friendships based on these things are easily dissolved, meaning they're easily forgotten. You can walk away from them easily. They don't have the impact that, say, losing a human friendship would have. Okay. And he says, for if someone is no longer pleasant or useful, the others stop loving them. Once the good thing that you're receiving comes to an end, then you lose your love for them. Okay. I guess in the case of the glass of wine, once the wine is gone, well, the whole point is moot. All right. Now, he goes further in his description here, and I have this picture of this old couple because to stay married that long, you have to be friends. So he says, but complete friendship is the friendship of good people similar in virtue, for they wish goods in the same way to each other insofar as they are good, and they are good in themselves. Hence, they wish goods to each other for each other's own sake. Hence, these people's friendship lasts as long as they are good, and virtue is enduring. I like that last sentence. These people's friendship lasts as long as they are good, and virtue is enduring. So what matters most is the people's goodness and their virtue, because as long as that's intact, which implies that it can sometimes crumble, that one's goodness and virtue can sometimes crumble. As long as it's intact, then the friendship will also endure. Okay? All right. Now, Aristotle makes a point for sure that the best of friends are rare. The best form of friendship is very rare because it's very rare to find very good or virtuous people. Okay? When you find them, they find each other similar in virtue. You find that their love for each other is unconditional. They love each other for their own sake. He says you find that there is complete trust between them because of the shared virtue. And there is complete equality. There's no difference between them as far as the quality of their character, so to speak. And so, of course, there is not one who is superior and one who is inferior. Next time we talk, we'll talk about that type of friendship. So he says, moreover, they need time to grow accustomed to each other. Okay. And this point rolls back into the point about trust. Okay. How do you develop trust amongst equals? Time. Okay. He says they need to grow accustomed to each other, for as the proverb says, they cannot know each other before they have shared the traditional peck of salt, and they cannot accept each other or be friends until each appears lovable to the other and gains the other's confidence. Those who are quick to treat each other in friendly ways wish to be friends, but are not friends, unless they are also lovable and know this. For though the wish for friendship comes quickly, friendship does not. All right. Now, this is a great gem of an insight, right? You cannot rush friendship because you can only get to a degree of knowledge of each other's character, knowledge of each other's goodness, and trust through a long time of conversation and working together and living together. Okay, so that you know the person through their actions as well as their words, and you have had repeated evidence of the virtue and of the equality. And this leads to trust. And that trust is the bond among friends. And when it happens, it's precious and rare. And when it dissolves, despite the fact that it's actually genuinely been achieved, it is the worst of tragedies. And the way that that would happen is through the erosion of virtue and goodness in one or both people. That's what he's saying. It takes a long time to develop, and it's very likely to endure. And the only thing that would dissolve it once it develops is the demolition of trust caused by the fall from virtue. Okay. Now, he talks a little bit about, incomplete friendships again. And he gives the example of a courtship. And the example is between a man and a boy, because in Greek culture, this was a romantic relationship that people had often while having marital relationships as well. But you could apply it to any kind of romantic relationship. He says, it is an example of incomplete friendship in this romantic relationship in which one is pursuing, and the other is enjoying being pursued. You definitely can apply this to, any kind of relationship, right? There is sometimes there's the one who's, definitely courting and pursuing, and the other is enjoying the flattery of being pursued. And he says, this cannot form a real bond because you're enjoying two different things. You're seeing two different things, right? You're like deriving different things from each other. You're not sharing the same thing. That is mutual regard, and equality, and trust, and shared values. All right. So this is what we would call a shallow relationship in which both are receiving, again, he wouldn't use these terms, but ego pleasure, the one from pursuing and trying to seduce, and the other from being pursued and feeling attractive. It is a shallow relationship, which is not a real friendship. Okay. And then he says something else about the loss of friendship, which I find to be very poignant. He says that distance does not necessarily dissolve friendship unconditionally, but only its activity. So first he says, because friendship is about mutual, it's about agreement on shared values and living life together. This can take place even if people don't see each other constantly. It does curtail some of the living together, the activity of friendship. But he does say if the absence is long, it also seems to cause the friendship to be forgotten. So there's a point where too much absence takes place. So this would indicate that friendship has to be constantly alive and maintained, that it has to be constantly nurtured, right? That if one, establishes a friendship and then takes it for granted and kind of walks away, that friendship is not going to be the same, let's say, a year from then as it was, right? So he says, hence the saying, lack of conversation has dissolved many a friendship. Because friends, he says, desire to spend their days together. So, in our very busy, fast-paced world, where people often do live far apart, where sometimes even married couples live in different states because of their jobs, and just even if we live very close together, we can hardly see each other because we have so many different things going on. We still have something that the Greeks didn't have, which is phones and laptops and things like that can, facilitate conversation. So the real issue is not, for us in particular, probably not distance, but time, right? And what Aristotle is saying to us, I think, is that if you want true, good, lasting friendship, you have to put in the time. And there's no point where that time can, is not important. That even the best of friendships can be forgotten through a lack of giving time to them. So this is a mistake that people often make. For instance, some of the best friends that you have made on your first job, or if you went to college, your college years, and you thought you were your best buddies, right? Really in sync on everything. And then you go off, you get a job. That doesn't mean you couldn't call, doesn't mean you couldn't visit, but that's what happens, right? And pretty soon years have gone by and you don't even remember the person. So anyway, the lesson here is, if you really want this good in your life, you've got to put the time in to continue to live life together in conversation and ideally in action.